Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we are going to explore the phenomenon of multiple personality, sometimes also called a dissociative identity, and it's related to multiple personality disorder and dissociative identity disorder. With me is philosopher Stephen Braude, who is the editor of the Journal of Scientific Exploration, an emeritus professor and former chair of the philosophy department at the University of Maryland in Baltimore County, and author of many books, in particular First Person Plural, Multiple Personality and the Philosophy of Mind. His other books include Immortal Remains, The Limits of Influence, Crimes of Reason, and The Gold Leaf Lady. Welcome, Stephen.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good to be here.
It's a pleasure to be with you once again.
Yes.
And the topic of multiple personalities is really one of the most intriguing in all of psychology. And as you write, the study of these phenomena really go back to the 19th century and the pioneers in the field of hypnosis.
Yes, the beginnings really can be traced back to a disciple of Franz Anton Mesmer, namely the Marquis de Puységur, who discovered when he was hypnotizing his patients a condition he called magnetic sleep. He found that when he mesmerized or magnetized his patients, they would often fall into a trance. And when they were in a trance, they were not literally out of it. They would still respond to his questions and behave according to instructions, but they remembered none of this later on. Mm-hmm. And eventually, after exploring that condition a bit, he and others that followed him decided there were really two different existences here. He thought that he had uncovered another stratum of mental life that coexisted with the waking consciousness that we're usually aware of.
In other words, one layer of consciousness interacted under hypnosis and could, under trance conditions, remember what happened, and another part of the consciousness had no memory at all.
Yes, there were state-specific memories that he discovered, although, of course, he didn't describe them quite that way. But he found that when remagnetized, his patients could remember what had happened in previous spasms of magnetic sleep, but in their normal waking consciousness, they didn't remember.
Mm-hmm. And how did he attribute that?
Well, he thought there was this coexisting level of consciousness that existed at the same time, but usually surreptitiously with the normal waking consciousness.
And then over the decades, he actually goes back, I think, earlier than the 19th century. He would have been an 18th century researcher.
Yes.
So maybe then over the next 100 years, over the next century, other researchers in hypnosis explored this phenomenon further.
They explored it in a variety of ways. And there were many theoretical disputes going on between what were called the fluidists and the animists. I mean, some, like Mesmer, thought that hypnosis really had to do with some sort of physical process happening between the hypnotist or the mesmerizer and the patient. And then the animists thought that it was really due to suggestion and psychological relations between the two. Mm-hmm.
And of course, the animists won out, I suppose.
I would say that seems to be the case, yes.
So there's a big difference between what we call hypnotism today and what was once known as mesmerism.
The term hypnotism was actually coined somewhat later by James Braude, who, among other things, explored, along with others in England, various interesting phenomena of hypnosis under surgical conditions.
People could be put under hypnosis and major surgeries could be performed. They didn't have anesthesia in the early years.
Those were among the most remarkable of early hypnotic discoveries. James Elliotson in England found that when he was dealing with an amputized leg, that the sciatic nerve was exposed, he found he could tweak the nerve, and the patient didn't respond at all, which of course wouldn't happen under any other conditions.
Yeah. So, bottom line here is that enormous alterations of human consciousness seem to occur as the result of hypnotic trance and hypnotic suggestion.
Alterations of consciousness and a state that the early pioneers of hypnosis call lucidity. That is, Mesmer and Puissigir and others found that their magnetized patients often were able to diagnose illnesses in others, and it seemed that they were exhibiting clairvoyant knowledge of what was going on in the world.
So when the Society for Psychical Research was formed in England in the mid-19th century, this is one of the first things they wished to explore.
Yes, they were convinced that dissociative phenomena, and hypnosis in particular, promise major insights into the nature of mental functioning that might not be discoverable any other way. And so one of the early pioneers of hypnotic research in England was Edmund Gurney, one of the pioneers of the SPR, the Society for Psychical Research. He did some very clever experiments in hypnosis.
And I suppose it's fair to say, looking back now, well over a century since this research began, these phenomena have held up. We now recognize that almost everything that was produced by the early researchers in mesmerism and hypnosis can be replicated today.
Yes, though there doesn't seem to be much interest in doing so. In fact, I'd say some of the early philosophical fascination with hypnotic states seems to have waned, which I think is a shame.
Well, and it took until, as I recall, 1954 before the American Medical Association recognized hypnosis as a valid form of therapy.
Actually, if I knew that, I've had a senior moment about it, so I'm glad to hear it from you.
Well, now let's relate these hypnotic phenomena to multiple personalities.
Well, especially toward the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, a number of mental health professionals seemed to discover that their patients were exhibiting more than just the additional level of consciousness discovered by Puissigir and others, and that in fact some of their patients seemed to have 2, 3, and sometimes more ongoing coexisting personalities. These would emerge spontaneously in therapy. The patient who came for treatment sometimes wasn't aware of this, usually wasn't aware of this, just recognized that things were going wrong. For example, that there might be periods of lost time. So someone might come in for therapy to Boris Sidis or Morton Prince, for example, some of the early pioneers, and say, I don't know what's happening. I'm finding strange clothes in my house. I find myself in places and don't know how I got there. And then under questioning by the therapist, it turns out that there are other personalities, seemingly, who came out during those times, supplanted the ordinary waking consciousness, or at least the presenting waking consciousness, and had a kind of existence of his or her own.
And hypnosis was not involved.
No, not explicitly, although skeptics of the condition would say that it was really just due to suggestion and a kind of iatrogenesis of the demand characteristics of the therapeutic setting.
In other words, the skeptics claim that the therapist really created this condition.
Yes, they wanted to say that it wasn't a genuine altered state. It was really a kind of role-playing brought on by the suggestive nature of the therapeutic situation.
Now, people who are my age or your age are probably very familiar with popular books and movies, The Three Faces of Eve being sort of an exemplar of this sort of thing. Multiple personality disorder is one of the most bizarre phenomenon ever reported, and I guess a lot of people aren't aware of how controversial it's been.
It's been controversial, but it's also much more interesting than you'd gather from watching dramatizations of the cases of Three Faces of Eve or Sybil or something like that. Because those classic cases, the ones we're familiar with through the media, are usually much more histrionic in their presentation than most genuine cases of multiple personality. where there might be more personalities involved, but where the switching between personalities is sometimes more gradual, sometimes more subtle, and rarely as dramatic, rarely as histrionic as you would think from watching dramatizations on TV or movies.
Oh, okay, well that's good to know in a way, but I suppose for the benefit of our viewers, it's important to state that in spite of the many controversies surrounding what is now called dissociative identity disorder, there's a vast literature, and the literature at this point is well over 100 years old.
Absolutely. And as far as the skeptical literature is concerned, I should mention that the attack on the legitimacy of multiple personality is continuous with a broader attack on hypnosis as a genuine altered state. So there are some skeptics of hypnosis who want to say that's really a kind of social compliance or role-playing as well.
Yeah.
And I think the easiest way to demonstrate how absurd that is to go back to those early studies of hypnotic anesthesia. So if you look at the work of James Esdale in India, he operated on many, many patients, removing great toenails by the roots, removing limbs, removing 100-pound scrotal tumors from his patients. There was a lot of elephantiasis going on. And the non-response of these patients under hypnosis, I think, is a paradigm case of an altered state. It's not just trying to please the surgeon.
It's not something that you can fake.
No. And earlier on, this was recognized too, when subjects were hypnotized to be anesthetic in various ways. You could put ammonia under their nose, they wouldn't automatically recoil. You could stick pins in them, they wouldn't recoil from that. There were various ways in which this was realized.
And when we look at multiple personality disorder, it's a term I think I prefer.
To dissociative identity.
I do, yeah.
I do too.
When we look at it, there's oftentimes physical changes associated with each personality.
Fascinating physical changes. So sometimes alternate personalities will differ with respect to their allergies. Some might be allergic to citrus and others not. Some might, in the famous case of Miss Beecham from Morton Prince, one of the personalities, or several of the personalities, could be subdued with chloroform, but another personality named Sally would emerge fresh and seemingly unaffected by chloroform. Eyeglass prescriptions can change, musculature in the face and elsewhere in the body can change, handedness can change.
I've even heard that the colors of the eyes change.
I've heard that too.
So, I mean, these are extraordinary changes that might lend somebody to think that something paranormal is going on. And we'll talk about that more in our third interview.
That's a leap.
Yeah.
It seems to me more likely that we're just dealing with unappreciated capacities of normal living human beings.
And which are very important to understand.
Perhaps abnormal, but I'm not sure paranormal.
Okay. And I'll just mention now as a little preview that our third interview in this three-part series that we're doing will focus in more detail on the relationship between multiple personalities and other related sorts of paranormal phenomenon. But let's get back to the issue of the personalities themselves and what it's like. Some people seem to feel that, as I understand it, they don't consider it a pathology. They just consider it a way of being.
There are some multiples who like to think of people without multiple personality disorder as suffering from single personality disorder. And the reason they've said that is easy to understand, because at least the more functional multiples, those who've managed to find a way of existing without being sabotaged by the switching of personalities, they often find ways of handling problems that are not available to non-multiples. So, for example, if the multiple is in pain, he or she might be able to switch to an anesthetic personality. I know of one graduate student multiple who would divide her coursework among altered personalities with appropriate abilities. So the one good at math would take the statistics course, the one good at art would take the art class, and so on.
Now, a lot of work in hypnosis suggests that states of consciousness close to multiple personality disorder can be induced through hypnosis. But in general, my understanding is that people who are suffering as a pathology, multiple personality disorder, typically come from backgrounds of early childhood abuse.
Or trauma of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's by now pretty well established. I mean, there are some controversial cases, but we know of many childhood cases, for example, with a documented history of abuse where the children have multiple personalities. Mm-hmm. They certainly didn't get the idea by reading the literature on it. So the general view of multiple personality that I think has become more or less received by now is that multiples are dissociative virtuosi who can respond to trauma or abuse in ways not available to those who are not so gifted dissociatively. Mm-hmm. Those who are not so gifted dissociatively might develop other kinds of pathologies like sexual dysfunction or various kinds of obsessions, for example.
Mm-hmm. We better define that term, dissociative.
Well, that's actually not easy, but it has to do with the more or less functional isolation of various systems of thought or various ideas mm-hmm. or various dispositions and so on.
As I understand it, the basic notion, going back to William James' stream of consciousness, is that all of the elements in our consciousness are correlated or related to each other through a process of association. And that disassociation involves some kind of a separation from that normal stream of consciousness, so it might seem alien.
Well, it doesn't have, there can be various pedestrian forms of dissociation. So you might dissociate, you're driving a car over a familiar route while you're driving. Mm-hmm. So it has to do with a certain kind of functional setting aside of various systems of thought or dispositions or beliefs or whatever it might be mm-hmm. from your normal waking consciousness in a retrievable fashion.
Mm-hmm. Well, in part 2 of our 3-part series, we're going to go into more detail on the theory of dissociation. But for now, let's talk a little bit more about the phenomenology. For example, it seems that for a person who's a multiple, some personalities are aware of others and some are not.
Yes, there seems to be various kinds of epistemological relations between the various alters in a multiples community. Mm-hmm. And sometimes multiples will even describe the system of alters, at least to the extent they're aware of them, as having a kind of coexistence under the surface. Some that I've known have said they hold something like council meetings mm-hmm. where they arrange to keep the sociopathic or homicidal alters under wraps, not allow them to come out, mm-hmm. to make sure that the child alters get time to play with their toys, the artistic alters get time to do their artistic work, and so on. Mm-hmm. So some are aware of others, some are aware of the thoughts of others, some are aware of the actions of others, whereas some alters might be oblivious to the existence of others in the community.
Which is often why, as you pointed out earlier, they would show up in a psychotherapist's office
Absolutely
in the first
right.
place.
That's right. And some of the alters, mm-hmm. I should mention, they can differ in quite interesting ways. Some of the alters might be of a different body shape, size, sex, various kinds of dispositions. Mm-hmm. And some alters will insist that they are the wrong body type or the wrong size or the wrong sex to wear the clothes of another alter, which is why sometimes people suffering from multiple personality disorder spend a great deal of time getting dressed in the morning. Mm. If they can't keep the same alter in control of the body and executive control mm-hmm. for that period of time, they might take several showers, they might make several changes of clothes, and so on.
Mm-hmm. Well, typically, how many different subpersonalities are there?
Typically, I would say between 6 and 8, but mm-hmm. Some clinicians claim that alters can be in the hundreds. Now, I'm not sure how you take an accurate head count in those cases. But what they have in mind there is that there are some so-called polyfragmented multiples, many of whose alter personalities or identities are actually highly circumscribed. Mm-hmm. And the way they understand it is that once a a multiple has gotten into the habit of dissociating to deal with traumas or abuse, it can become a habitual way of dealing with unpleasant situations in life. And so as the multiples get older, they might be dissociating to deal with quite mundane things, like there might be an alter whose sole job is to clean toilets or take enemas or to have sex or only certain kinds of sex or to deal with relatives on holidays or to bake cookies.
Well, and it raises the question of exactly what is an alter. I mean, it's a funny term because it almost suggests the idea that this is a completely different individual.
Well, in order to get into that, we do have to get into a little bit of theory.
Yeah.
But what I would say is that alter identities or personalities are discontinuous in a very interesting phenomenological and epistemological way from other alters. We don't understand in the normal non-multiple how a self-consciousness arises. That's one of the big questions in the philosophy of mind.
Yeah.
So we certainly don't understand how multiple ones arise in the case of a multiple personality. But if you take the phenomenology seriously, it looks as if different alters actually are different centers of self-consciousness. I call them apperceptive centers. But don't get bogged down in the terminology. The idea is that there are certain states that alters have that they experience as their own, certain states which they believe to be their own, whether or not they experience them as their own. And one thing that distinguishes multiples from other kinds of dissociative subjects is that these centers of self-awareness, these apperceptive centers, are, let's say, epistemologically and phenomenologically discontinuous from others. That is, that the states which one alter believes and experiences to be his or her own, another alter does not experience to be his or her own.
Well, we're going to go into this in more detail in part 2.
That's a challenge.
Yeah. Getting back, though, to the idea of multiple personality disorder as a clinical entity, 2 questions. One is, how prevalent is it? And second of all, what about the idea that there's a continuum, that there are many people who would be regarded as normal people, not psychopathological, but they exhibit multiple personalities just in the normal course of their life, and nobody thinks twice about it.
Well, let's try to take these in turn. How prevalent is it? I don't think we know. I mean, it was diagnosed early in the 20th century, not terribly often, but somewhat often. Then it seemed to wane as Freudian dynamics became very popular, and a lot of patients were being diagnosed as schizophrenic rather than as being multiples. It made a kind of comeback in the late 20th century, and maybe clinicians got a little too enthusiastic and were too ready to diagnose it. Today, I'm still not sure whether we have a firm grip on just how prevalent it is. Whether we diagnose it or not, it may have to do with prevailing psychological theories. So it's not diagnosed as readily in France as it is in the U.S. In France, Freudian dynamics is still more popular than other dynamics.
And according to Freudian dynamics, a case that might otherwise be diagnosed as multiple personality disorder would be thought of as
schizophrenic or something.
A form of psychosis.
Yeah, it would still be thought of as a form of psychosis because typically the patient is dysfunctional in some way that requires treatment.
Schizophrenic meaning splitting away from reality.
Yeah, it's hard to explain the difference between repression and dissociation without going into areas I don't think you want to go into.
No, we don't need to do that right now.
Right. Your other question was?
What about might you say that there's a continuum of experience from the severely pathological to kind of multiple personalities that we display in ordinary life because we all play many different roles?
Well, there's a difference, I think, between engaged role-playing and multiple personality because engaged role-playing, I think, can all still be described from the same first-person perspective. In addition to being a philosopher, I'm a musician.
Right.
And I find it very hard to juggle the two. So I used to teach philosophy in classrooms with pianos, and students would often like me to combine the two. I found that very difficult to do. But no matter how separate those roles felt to me, I would still describe it from the same first-person perspective. That's something that multiples can't do.
In fact, you have a website called The Jazz Philosopher, as I recall.
I do. Yeah. But still, multiples don't have that option at their disposal. To them, the different roles have to be described and are inevitably described from different first-person perspectives.
Well, that's a significant difference.
It is. But I have to say that as far as not recognizing when someone is multiple or not, or how obvious or flagrant the presentation of symptoms would be, it's a common fact that people can be married to a multiple and not know. You could be very close to a multiple and not know, because multiples are often very motivated to conceal their condition. They know it's a way of asking for trouble. And so unless you're on the lookout for it, it's all too easy for the husband, for example, of a multiple, to think that his wife is just very changeable or moody or eccentric. And when the child personalities come out in a safe environment, like in the context of a toy store, where childish behavior might look like an innocuous form of exuberance, it's all too easy to write it off as something else.
I see. Well, getting back to the question of prevalence, my best guess would be that it must be about as prevalent as certain other major psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, which I think maybe affects roughly 1% of the population.
You could be right. I wouldn't know how to place a number on it.
Okay. Well, what would you say it would be at the maximum?
That's a really tough question. I mean, it really depends a lot on the discernment of the clinician.
Yeah.
And how deeply they get into the lives of their patients. I really don't know.
Oh, okay.
I'm not helping you.
Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, and I'll make a guess.
Okay.
I would say that the prevalence is somewhere between 1% and 5 or 10%.
I can't say that's an outrageous idea. You may be exactly right.
Well, Stephen Braude, thank you so much for sharing this half hour with me. It went quickly.
Thank you, Jeff.
It's been a pleasure.
Me too.
And thank you for being with us, and be sure to check your listings for part 2 of this 3-part series on multiple personalities.